Hey, you guys, do you love old Hollywood? The podcast Stars of the Golden Age dives into the lives of your favorite Hollywood stars. Host Erin Carlson, my new BFF, gives you an in-depth look into the lives of Cary Grant, Vivien Leigh, Frank Sinatra, Audrey Hepburn, Lucille Ball, and many more. Learn things that you may have never heard before about these iconic stars as you're taken on a journey through their lives behind the scenes. For this episode you're about to hear, Erin shares the story of Mr. Sherlock Holmes himself, Basil Rathbone. OMG, so excited. So sit back and enjoy this Madison on the Air Presents special episode of Stars of the Golden Age. And be sure to listen to all of Erin's other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Plus, I put a link in our show notes. Okay, enjoy!
Hello, listeners. Welcome to Stars of the Golden Age, a show that highlights the lives of legends from film, music, and the birth of television during Hollywood's Golden Age, with a special emphasis on their lives behind the scenes. I am your host, Erin Carlson. Today, we will be talking about the man who famously brought the character of Sherlock Holmes to life on the screen, Mr. Basil Rathbone. Philip St. John Basil Rathbone was born in South Africa, Johannesburg, on June 13, 1892. His father, Edgar, was British, hailing from Liverpool, but living in Johannesburg for work. And his mother, Anna, was Irish. The work that had brought the couple to Johannesburg was gold mining. Edgar was a mine inspector. It was a family tradition in the Rathbone family to not use the given first names. So, Philip St. John Basil Rathbone became Basil as soon as he was born. He was the first child for the couple. Basil Rathbone's life turned adventurous at a very young age when the family was forced to make an escape after the South African Boers accused Edgar of being a British spy. Basil was 3 years old and another baby had just been born. And the four of them snuck onto a freight train to make their grand escape. Here is Basil Rathbone's later recounting of the daring adventure. Quote, "At one end of the car there was a small wooden seat. There my mother sat with her 2 children in her arms, while underneath it crouched my father, well hidden by the voluminous folds of my mother's skirt. Intermittently could be heard the sounds of voices and the coupling and uncoupling of cars as the freight train was made up. Every start held the promise that we were on our way, and the hope that my father could take a brief respite from the cramped hiding place." End quote. They traveled this way for hundreds of miles. The adventure continued when first Anna and then the 2 small children became very sick with typhoid fever and were forced to leave the train and admitted to a hospital in Durban, where they were forced to stay for several weeks as they healed. But they were out of immediate danger, from the Boers at least. Their health was a whole other danger. Once Anna and the children recovered, which thank goodness they all did, the family was finally able to make the rest of their journey back to England. And that was surrounded by tragedy and adventure too. While Anna had been deliriously ill with typhoid fever, she had a horrific dream about the ship that they were booked for passage on back to England. According to Basil's memoir, his mother dreamed that the very ship they were to travel on was caught in a terrible storm and sunk. She recounted the nightmare to Edgar and begged him to change their tickets. He was obviously eager to get out of the country, but his wife was persistent. So he booked passage on a different ship a week later. And it's a good thing he did, because Anna's premonition came true. That first ship did sink. and everyone aboard died. The family settled in London, and Basil became very inspired by an older cousin named Frank Benson, who was a highly respected actor and the founder of his own theater company. This was young Basil's idol. After they had returned to London, Edgar and Anna had welcomed a third child, another son, and the three children lived a warm and happy childhood. Basil was tall and naturally athletic, excelling at cricket and football in school. He spent his high school years about 140 miles from home at Repton School in Derbyshire, and he would only be home living with his family during the summers. Repton was known as an athletic-centered school, and Basil did really well in athletics there. But what he really wanted to be doing was theater, something he kept a very guarded secret from his cricket and football buddies. He had a reputation to uphold at school. When Basil graduated at 17 years old in 1909, he felt as though he was finally free to follow his true passion of acting. But Repton had been an expensive school, and his parents weren't really in the position to easily pay for such expensive tuition. So they felt that he owed them a more practical and higher regarded career path than what the theater could provide him. That was a risky path to take, they thought, even with his cousin's influence and connections. So Basil reluctantly took on a job at his grandfather's company, the Globe Insurance Company. All his father asked is that he work there for 1 year, and then he could do as he pleased with his life. Edgar hoped that in that 1 year, his son would see the professional potential that working at the family company could provide him. Edgar's hopes were deflated after that year because Basil eagerly walked away from that company and directly toward his dreams. In April of 1911, 18-year-old Basil Rathbone won his first professional acting part, a role in his cousin Frank Benson's company's production of The Taming of the Shrew. He did so well that he was invited to join the company's Shakespearean tour to the United States the following year. Through Basil Rathbone's budding career in the theater, he also found love. He met actress Marian Foreman when he was 21 years old. She was 26, when they were cast opposite one another in a production. They got married on October 3rd, 1914. In their wedding announcement, Basil was listed as, quote, bachelor professional actor, while Marian was listed as, quote, spinster on profession. Basil and Marian were almost instantly expecting a baby, and they welcomed their baby boy, Rodion, almost exactly 9 months after getting married. The future was looking very bright for Basil. He had by then made it to the theaters of London's West End. He was happily married, and he was the proud father of a little boy. But outside of his happy little bubble, war loomed, and with it loomed the moral pressures to enlist. He, of course, did not want to, but he felt he had to. So on March 30th, 1916, he put his acting career on hold, kissed his wife and infant son goodbye, and set off to war. War was, of course, horrific, but Basil was a born leader and walked away a war hero and recipient of the Military Cross. He also walked away with terrible nightmares of the horrors of war. Similar to his mother's premonition of the passenger ship sinking years earlier, Basil Rathbone claimed to have clairvoyant and psychic abilities. This was emotionally exhausting for him because the visions he had were almost always bad ones, almost always of impending death. One such premonition came to him in his sleep towards the end of the war, and the person who died in that dream was his beloved brother John. Here is what Basil Rathbone said of it. Quote, a few weeks later, at 1 o'clock on June 4th, 1918, I was sitting in my dugout on the front line. Suddenly, I thought of John, and for some inexplicable reason, I wanted to cry. And I did. Immediately, I wrote him a letter to which he never replied. And in due course, I received news of his death in action at exactly 1 o'clock on June the 4th. We had always been very close to one another." End quote. Sadly, Basil's mother Anna had died just 2 years prior, right after sending her boys off to war. The once happy and thriving Rathbone family was now forever changed. 2 of them were gone, and the surviving were never again the same as they had been before the Great War. Like so many other men returning to their normal lives after the war, doing so was anything but normal. The war had been one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Basil Rathbone, and most every other man who had fought, had killed people and seen countless men die right in front of him. They had lost friends and been forced to commit unspeakable acts. War leaves soldiers with scars that could never be completely healed, and Basil Rathbone was left with many. He was emotionally damaged. He was not the same young man who had left to serve his country. Yet he and all of the other men who were suffering from horrible post-traumatic stress disorder, before that was a diagnosis, of course, were expected to return home and hop right back into their lives and duties that they had before they left. But Basil's love for life was gone. His natural enthusiasm was gone. His ambitions were gone. And his ability to be the husband and father his awaiting wife wanted him to be was also gone. Less than a year after returning home from the war, Basil and Marion separated. He moved out, but Marion held on to hope that the marriage could be salvaged. But as 27-year-old Basil Rathbone worked to reestablish his acting career, while playing Romeo in a production of Romeo and Juliet, he fell hopelessly in love with his Juliet, a 19-year-old actress named Joyce Carey. The romance only lasted about 6 months, but another serious romance quickly followed, both signaling the definite end of his marriage to Marion. Basil Rathbone hadn't been able to pop right back in where he had left his career before the war, but it didn't take him long to be flying high again as a respected and beloved theater actor. He was mingling in all the right circles with all the right people, and the future was once again looking bright. Motion pictures were gaining steam fast, and although devoted to the stage, Basil Rathbone decided to give this marvel a shot. His film debut was in a 1921 British silent film called Innocent. He did a couple of films in 1921, and then at the end of that year, he stepped his feet back onto the stage, where they felt most effective and accomplished. But not in London's West End. He was heading for the Empire Theatre on Broadway in New York City to perform in the Tsarina. Basil Rathbone had fallen in love with the U.S. when he first visited as a young, fresh actor, and he was so happy to be back. The course of his life was forever changed when he took that voyage to America and that job on Broadway, because reminiscent to Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier's origin story, there was a woman in the audience one evening who, upon seeing Basil Rathbone's performance, turned to her friend and said, "One day, I'm going to marry that man." And like Vivien Leigh, she was married to another man at the time. Well, she did marry that man, just not quite yet. It took 2 whole years for Basil Rathbone to meet the woman who had declared him to be her husband from her seat at the Empire Theatre, but he finally did in November of 1923. The woman was Ouida Bergère, and she was a New York City socialite, a very prominent figure in New York's high society. But she was much more than that. She was a former actress who had turned to writing, starting first in newspaper and magazine publications, and moving on to screenwriting. At the time Basil Rathbone met her in 1923, Ouida was one of silent film's most prominent screenwriters. As such, she was rolling in 3 times the pay that Basil was as an actor, and he was making pretty good money. Basil fell instantly in love. He was a hopeless romantic and a repeat victim of love at first sight. But it was different with Ouida. She was electric. There was the little problem of him still being legally married, and that estranged wife being far, far away in another country. If he wanted to marry Ouida Bergère, he would have to officially close the door on his former life, and she on hers. She was still legally married to her third husband. The time had finally come that Basil would have to officially say goodbye to his wife and the son that he hardly knew. He and Ouida took the trip to England in the summer of 1924, shortly after he scratched another accomplishment off his list of accomplishments in his new American life. His first American silent film, Trooping with Ellen. Although Basil loved his new life in the States, he was happy to return home and see old friends and family. Tragically, Basil's father passed away just before they arrived in England. He died on Basil's 32nd birthday. 34-year-old Basil Rathbone and 39-year-old Ouida Bergère were finally able to say I do on April 18, 1926. The very next day, Basil reported to work for his next motion picture, the one that would become his last silent film, The Great Deception. Now married, Ouida left her successful screenwriting career to put her full support towards her new husband. Basil continued his successful stage work, and then in early 1929, he was lured into the MGM family and signed to a contract. His first talking film was 1929's The Last of Mrs. Cheney with Norma Shearer for MGM, and it was a great success. It was Basil Rathbone's first talking picture, and only MGM's second. While many silent film stars had not been accepted into this world of talkies, Basil Rathbone's voice was perfect and joyfully embraced. And with that, his film career began to soar. Goodbye, New York. Hello, Hollywood. With film after film planned for him at MGM on the West Coast, Basil and Ouida made their grand move westward, first planting their roots on Crescent Drive in Beverly Hills. Ouida immediately embraced their new life in Hollywood and instantly settled herself into Hollywood society. Entertaining and mingling with the best of the best was what she was made for. During breaks between films, when the timing allowed, Basil would return to Broadway for productions. He always wanted to keep his heart connected to the stage. Things were going great in Hollywood. There wasn't much time to return to New York because Basil Rathbone turned out movie after movie. But in May of 1932, he was growing a bit restless. He felt as though he was losing the passion he felt for his beloved acting. He was an artist, and he felt he couldn't practice that art in the factory that was Hollywood movie making. He was just a component of the finely oiled machine, conducting take after take until the desired product was achieved. He missed the continuity of telling a story. In movies, it's just little fragments of a story, often out of order, that are spliced together in the end for the audience. This didn't fuel his passion. He was increasingly running low on time to do stage work on Broadway, and he just felt he needed a little break from the hustle and bustle of Hollywood. And he was a bit homesick for England. So, in May of 1932, Basil and Ouida packed up and made the long journey to England, with plans to stay a while, hopefully do a project on London's West End, and maybe try to squeeze in a British film or two. But when they arrived in London, Basil felt a little disappointed in his reception. He thought, after his great successes on Broadway and Hollywood in the US, he would be met with celebration. But that didn't really happen. Maybe they felt betrayed by his leaving in the first place. He wasn't sure. But he set off to conquer his goals just the same. And he did do a couple of British films while there, Loyalties and After the Ball. Also during this visit, Basil reunited with his son, the son he had barely seen since he left for the Great War when Rodion was only 9 months old. Rodion was now almost a man himself at 17, and although they wrote regularly, they were physical strangers, father and son. Basil Rathbone was eager to return to the stage, but as it turned out, it would be the American stage he would be gracing again. His trip to England was cut short when he was approached by the First Lady of the theater herself, Katharine Cornell, to play the leads in a U.S. 3-play tour production of Romeo and Juliet, The Barretts of Wimpole Street, and Candida. And so began his next adventure, back on his beloved stage, on a 7-month, 86-city American tour. Sold-out show after sold-out show. After fueling his passion on the stage, Basil was ready to return to Hollywood. It was, after all, really good money. And he returned with a bang and great praise for his role of Pontius Pilate in The Last Days of Pompeii, followed by a couple of Charles Dickens classics, A Tale of Two Cities and David Copperfield, amongst other movies. He actually turned down the role of Murdstone in David Copperfield 5 times, because as he said, you can't play a man who is poison to you. But David O. Selznick and George Cukor pleaded with him so badly that he gave in. He regretted it the moment he was forced to hit child actor Freddie Bartholomew over and over, take after take. It was so difficult for him to do, which I hope it would be for anyone, with the boy crying in pain. Oh, 1935, they were often pretty brutal back then. And they turned them out quickly back then too. Basil Rathbone is credited with a whopping 7 movies in 1935 alone, including Captain Blood with Errol Flynn and Anna Karenina with Greta Garbo. The following year brought Basil Rathbone his first Academy Award nomination for his work in the film rendition of one of his very favorite stories to play out for audiences, Romeo and Juliet. For the first time, though, he was not Romeo. Leslie Howard was, alongside Norma Shearer as his Juliet. Basil Rathbone played the supporting character of Tybalt. Sadly, Norma Shearer's husband and Romeo and Juliet producer and overall MGM king of productions, Irving Thalberg, died just after they finished filming Romeo and Juliet. A huge loss for Hollywood. Basil Rathbone got a chance to get to know his son a little more in 1937 when, freshly graduated from Cambridge, Rodian decided to take a long visit to California to stay with his father for a while. The visit was good for the father-son relationship, at first at least. And it was good for Rodian's love life because he met what would become his wife, a hopeful actress named Carolyn Fisher. As you did in that day, they were almost instantly engaged, and Ouida immediately started planning a grand wedding for them at their home. They, by this time, had moved to a mansion on Bellagio Road in Bel Air, which still stands today at a massive 7,800 square feet. Rodian and Carolyn would have been happy with just a small wedding with family, or even a courthouse wedding. But if Ouida loved one thing, it was throwing a party. She loved throwing grand, lavish, and expensive parties. She planned a grand event in the Rathbones' garden, even filling the swimming pool with orchids, and inviting every top Hollywood star that she had in her address book. It soon became apparent that this was Ouida's wedding, not the actual bride and groom's. It became such a star-studded spectacle that A-list guest Gary Cooper snapped at a photographer taking his picture at the wedding. "Why are you photographing me? I'm not the groom." The wedding went well. Ouida was happy, and the newlyweds were gifted a fully furnished home in Hollywood as a wedding present from Basil and Ouida, which the bride graciously declined. And that really pissed off Ouida. How rude of her to turn down such a generous and thoughtful gift. The situation turned into a massive argument, and Basil was on his wife's side. In the end, Rodian and Carolyn left Hollywood and settled in Chicago, and the father-son relationship was never mended. There had been so much promise shown for their relationship to finally flourish, but it seems Ouida had reacted in such an ugly manner over the wedding and the gift, and her perceived ungratefulness of the bride and groom, that promise was killed. Instead, the relationship was severed, and Basil Rathbone would only see his son one more time during his life, 20 years after the wedding. Let's move along to Sherlock Holmes. That's what all of this has been leading up to, right? It was the fall of 1938, 20th Century Fox, and studio head Darryl F. Zanuck was going to bring Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes to life on the silver screen. It wouldn't be Sherlock Holmes' first time being portrayed on screen, but Zanuck was going to make sure it was the best. It was immediately decided that Basil Rathbone had to be their Sherlock Holmes, and fellow British actor Nigel Bruce had to be his Watson. Then sets were quickly planned and created on the Fox backlot to portray Dartmoor. Here is how Nigel Bruce later recalled it. Quote, "The entire soundstage was surrounded by a circular screen of canvas on which was painted a very lifelike picture of Dartmoor. The center of the stage was filled with large boulders made of plaster of Paris. Here and there a bridge was seen, and several caves were visible. Running through the boggy marsh-like ground were several small streams. For 8 weeks we worked in this set, and the atmosphere was most unpleasant as the fog which was necessary to the story was made up by artificial methods and freshly pumped into the stage after every shot. The effect reached, however, was eerie and foreboding, and the picture turned out to be an excellent one." End quote. The Hound of Baskervilles, 20th Century Fox's introduction of Sherlock Holmes, played by the man who seemed to be born to play it, Basil Rathbone, premiered on March 31st, 1939, to instant acclaim. Basil Rathbone now was Sherlock Holmes, whether he liked it or not. And what he thought was going to be just another role in just another film, to his surprise, turned into a series of many films. There was more excitement happening in the Rathbones' lives in 1939 besides the success of Sherlock Holmes and the Hounds of Baskervilles. Just 2 weeks after the film's release, Basil Rathbone would get another chance at fatherhood when he and Ouida adopted their daughter, Cynthia, born on April 13, 1939. Basil Rathbone took his role as father much more seriously this time around. He adored his daughter, and she adored him. The addition of an infant to their home did not stop Ouida from entertaining. Here is an account from a temporary member of their staff from that time in 1939, Joseph Ishikawa. Quote, "Ouida Rathbone was considered the leading dinner hostess in Hollywood. One time, while I was working there, she had 100 guests to dinner. She had 12 stoves lined up along the walled fence over the golf course, and each cooking from the same menu for one of the 10 tables of 10 diners. Of the 2 weeks I was on the job, Ouida also held a dinner party for 10 people, which included Hedy Lamarr, Charles Boyer and his wife Pat, Norma Shearer, the Canadian actress, Mervyn LeRoy and his wife, and several others. Basil Rathbone was a very decent, considerate man. He didn't take a chauffeured limousine to work, but drove himself, leaving at 6 a.m. and returning home after 6 p.m. One day, he had spent 10 hours filming in the water, and when he returned had a cheerful greeting for everyone. Then he asked Ouida how her day had gone. She had gotten up after noon and complained that the day had gone badly. He sympathized, but she never inquired how his day had been." End quote. Less than 2 months after The Hound of the Baskervilles was released, filming began on the next Sherlock Holmes installment, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Gotta keep them coming while the audience is engaged and excited. And after that one, execs at 20th Century Fox decided they would lie Sherlock Holmes to rest there. As the Second World War revved up in Europe, Basil Rathbone again wanted to serve his home country of England. But when he tried, he was respectfully turned down. At 47 years old, he was too old. So he decided he would do what he could from his adopted home country of the United States. First by spearheading big fundraising campaigns. But one big way many stars were helping was through radio. Basil had already done quite a bit of radio work throughout the 1930s, from variety shows to radio dramas to panel shows. Along with war-related broadcasts as the calendar turned to the 1940s, Rathbone also reprised his most famous character of Sherlock Holmes on the radio. He and his sidekick, Nigel Bruce as Dr. Watson, recorded the adventures of Sherlock Holmes for NBC, and their adventures kept eager audiences entertained for 24 weeks. So entertained that they returned for 4 more seasons. Basil Rathbone was also still putting out movies. He was a beloved presence of both the screen and radio waves. And with the popularity of Sherlock Holmes hanging on through the radio, another Hollywood studio decided to ride the success of it starting in 1942. If Fox didn't want Sherlock Holmes, Universal was happy to take it over. Through Universal Studios, 12 more Sherlock Holmes movies were made featuring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. And they were made back-to-back in quick succession. And this was helped extremely by a little secret Basil shared later on. None of the Sherlock Holmes movies done at Universal ever took longer than 17 days to complete. They were easy to turn out, and the cast and crew got along so well they were like family. It was easy money, but it came at a huge price for Basil Rathbone. Along the way, he realized he had become Sherlock Holmes in the public's eye, and he grew to really resent that. Everywhere he went, every interview he gave, Sherlock Holmes was always the center of conversation. He had lost his creative spark while devoting himself to Sherlock Holmes, and he really wanted to get it back. So, in 1946, he announced that the latest film of the series, Dressed to Kill, would be the last one to feature him as Sherlock Holmes, which meant the franchise was over. There could be no more Sherlock Holmes adventures without Basil Rathbone, because Basil Rathbone was Sherlock Holmes. And his decision to walk away put a huge strain on his personal friendship with Nigel Bruce, who played Watson in all of the films. Bruce did not want it to end. He wanted to keep riding the success of Sherlock Holmes as long as possible. Their friendship was eventually able to be mended, but it took a bit. Not only did Basil Rathbone want out of the character, he wanted out of Hollywood. It was time to head back to New York and get his feet on the stage again. Fueled with excitement for the next chapter in his career, a chapter back in the theater where he felt he belonged, Basil Rathbone quickly realized that he was now followed by a huge cloud over his head. He had been typecast by the famous character he brought to life for so long on the silver screen and through radio waves. He was a victim of the curse of Sherlock Holmes, and theater producers, he soon discovered, were weary about casting him because of it. But after a long year of worrying about his professional future, an offer did come in, and it ended up being exactly what he needed. It was a play called The Heiress, and it played to sold-out houses in New York for a year before going on the road for a year. It ran for a total of 410 performances and earned Basil Rathbone a Tony Award for lead actor. Alongside his return to the stage, he also returned to radio in the radio drama The Tales of Fatima for CBS, which he did for a 44-week run. Basil had been worried about the huge gamble he took leaving Sherlock Holmes and his Hollywood film career behind, but it seemed the gamble was paying off. But after wrapping up the 2 years with The Heiress, that promise seemed to dwindle again. The theater roles just weren't coming in. Basil did the rounds on all the popular television variety shows of the day, and he never gave up hope for a renewed popularity on the stage with good roles that fueled his artistic soul. Finally, in 1953, Basil wondered if what he had to do was bring Sherlock Holmes back, the character he had wanted to leave in the past. He enlisted the help of his wife, Ouida, to write a script. Remember, she was once a successful screenwriter. And they made plans to bring Sherlock Holmes to life on the stage. Unfortunately, Nigel Bruce had suffered a heart attack and was unable to reprise his character of Dr. Watson in the production, and he actually died later that year. Basil Rathbone had huge hopes for the success of this play, but it wasn't received with the enthusiasm he had hoped for. It only lasted for 3 performances. As Basil Rathbone said in his autobiography, quote, "The opening night audience in New York had seemed listless, and only modest applause had greeted our efforts. The Wednesday morning reviews dug a deep grave for us. The afternoon papers shoveled us in, and in due course, the magazines covered us up." End quote. Basil Rathbone spent the next several years appearing on TV variety and game shows, doing television commercials, doing stage work, and traveling back west and appearing in supporting roles of movies. He wasn't ready to hang up his hat, and he had Ouida's lifestyle and lavish parties to fund. Speaking of Ouida, she and Basil received a visit in 1958 or 1959 from one of Basil's estranged son Rodion's daughters. Now a young adult, she wanted to meet her famous grandfather. Here is what she recalled of the visit. Quote, "My first and only meeting with him was difficult. I came away pretty sure I didn't want to meet Ouida ever again. She regaled me for 2 hours with tales of how awful my parents were, and this after 20 years. I was polite and furious. Basil was quiet, and I came away feeling she had all the power because he gave it to her. He could be the most brilliant villain on screen, but in his home, it was a different story." End quote. Although others had unsavory things to say about Ouida at times, her devoted husband never spoke an unkind word about her. By 1965, the theater roles had dried up and the movie roles were too embarrassing for Basil to even want to talk about. He was 73 years old and he still had to earn a paycheck. The lifestyle they had lived throughout the years and continued to live had eaten up any savings and forced him to keep bringing home a paycheck. He appeared in a number of low-budget films, mostly horrors. Movies with titles like Queen of Blood, Hillbillies in a Haunted House, and The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini. You get the idea. Basil Rathbone literally worked himself to death. On July 21st, 1967, at the age of 75, Basil Rathbone suffered a heart attack and died at his New York home. His daughter Cynthia is the one who found him. Tragically, Cynthia herself passed away just 2 years later at only 30 years old. And now I would like to share a few other interesting things I learned during my research. Bullet point number 1. Basil Rathbone was an expert swordsman and was a British Army fencing champion. Bullet point number 2. Basil Rathbone was a huge dog lover and almost always had a beloved dog by his side. He usually had several dogs at any given time. Bullet point number 3. Basil Rathbone was Margaret Mitchell's first choice to play Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. Bullet point number 4. The day Basil Rathbone died, July 21st, was his estranged son's birthday. So not only did Basil Rathbone die on his son's birthday, but his own father, Edgar, died on his son Basil's birthday. So 2 fathers dying on their sons' birthdays. In conclusion, Basil Rathbone knew from a young age that he wanted to be an actor. He had an energetic and creative soul, and he knew he belonged on the stage. He was a classical actor, having played every major Shakespearean lead on the stage. And that is where his heart always remained. It was the character of Sherlock Holmes, however, that made him a superstar and made him a very wealthy man. The character he brought to life, thinking it would be a one-time role and he would say goodbye to Sherlock Holmes like he had every other movie character he played. Little did he know at the time, but he would be Sherlock Holmes for 7 years and 14 movies, not to mention on the radio. And the role would forever change his life and career. He may have resented the character, but Sherlock Holmes and Basil Rathbone's portrayal of him have been beloved by so many, and always will be. Thank you, Basil Rathbone, for perfectly bringing Sherlock Holmes to life. And thank you for reminding us to always chase our dreams. And thank you all for listening. Reach for the positive in every day, be kind to everyone you encounter, and have a great rest of your week. My primary source for this episode was a book titled The Curse of Sherlock Holmes, The Basil Rathbone Story by David Clayton, and IMDb.